montagne dal me Piemunt che passa in front sta mia città montagne dal me país che spiccerei al paradis portella senta al cielo il sole ti sei lu che a sta città ai manca il fiar per protestare.
Buonasera carissimi. Welcome to researchroadshow.com. Today is January 24th. Magari, cosa Giulio. Today is January 24th, and you are synchronized to Research Roadshow, The Italian Job. I opened today with a song called Montagne del me Piemonte, the mountains of my beloved Piedmont, which has nothing to do with Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. Thank God. That song was sung by Gipo Farassino, who lived just about a mile away from me in Turin. But it was a song, a very popular song, and it was sung by my friend Luciano Fontana on a CD which I have here somewhere. Luciano Fontana passed away at 63 of a very rapid lung cancer. And it makes me wonder if Luciano's passing was in some way connected with our friends l'Isola di Gibson Island. Anyway, the reason I brought up Luciano tonight was, the reason I thought of Luciano early this morning was because of the trees. There's talk here in Atlanta of the tree cover being diminished. And Luciano's brother-in-law was the head up until around 2007. He was the head of taking care of the tree cover in Turin. And Turin is famous because of its streets, which have 3 traffic lanes, and the central traffic lane is bordered by a very wide 20-foot tree line on each side, and the trees are enormous. I think most of them are oak. Not oak. Now I'm having difficulty remembering, but it's a very large tree, and it requires to not grow outward too much and to grow upward. It requires very precise pruning. Luciano's brother-in-law was very concerned, and this is around 2007, pre-Lehman Brothers. He was very concerned about the way that the city was maintaining the trees. They were pruning the trees way too short. And the confusion of Luciano's brother-in-law was that if CO2 was a problem, because at this point it's more than 30 years that they're talking about CO2, carbon dioxide to be specific. If carbon dioxide is a problem, then why are they pruning the trees so heavily? It didn't make sense to him. And above all, why are they not planting new trees in newly excavated areas, brownfield areas? There was plenty of space for the addition of new trees. So a few months ago, I ran some numbers, and I thought, if Luciano was right, given the investments that we had made, between 1990 and 2007 in the greening of Piedmont, in the addition of jobs to the clean environment, clean energy, etc. Given those investments, we should have seen a 25% increase in the number of trees, or specifically the number of leaves, the total number of leaves on the trees, because that would offset somewhat the increase in CO2 production by our factories, okay? And remember that Fiat Turin is the home of Fiat Automotive and of Iveco and several other smaller plants. So there is, we badly needed this increased coverage of trees, and well, just to keep the aesthetics of the town. It's a win-win-win situation, a very rare case. Maintaining the trees to the way they were for the previous 100 years maintains property values. It maintains the aesthetics for tourists. There's a whole series of advantages to having the trees kept in a proper manner. So one lesson for Georgia and for Atlanta specifically is don't do what Turin did between 1995 and 2007. Don't destroy your tree cover. All right, I'm going to pull up a graphic here that describes the I said last week that I was going to talk about the economy and how the Italian economic miracle between 1948 and 1977 roughly went south after 1977. Now the thing to note here is that the World Economic Forum that we're talking about in many of the alternative news sites is largely based on or centered around the old Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was according to what they told me back in the late 80s, early 90s, the Trilateral Commission was supposed to be just a bunch of old fuddy-duddy economists that, they did their thing and nobody really paid attention to them. And it turned out not to be the case. It turns out the Trilateral Commission has tremendous sway in how things are run, not only in Europe, but in the United States as well. All right, let's go to the first graphic. I am not an economist. I don't even play one on TV. However, what I do have is when I was at Rensselaer Polytechnic, I did take 4 economics courses, 2 basic and 2 master's level courses in economics, macroeconomics. And along the way, I picked up a good number of textbooks in the area of economics, especially those associated with entrepreneurship. I wanted to understand badly how many areas in the United States, for example, Silicon Valley, were doing so well in churning out new companies and generating jobs for the local economy, and why in Turin and Milan we were doing so poorly. So let me pull those up right now. This is the central, in my opinion, this is the central, this was in 2009, the central problem. And it's the way that the economists predict it's the manner through which they dictate policy, monetary policy and fiscal policy, that will theoretically improve the economic situation of a given country. Okay, here we have, many of you have seen this before. There are more advanced models, but this is the only one I could come up with on short notice. This is a steam pipe flow of economic flow model. And you see that you have the government sector at the top, the household sector on the right, and the business sector on the left. And at the bottom is the foreign sector. Well, there are more advanced models, at least back in the early 2000s, there were more advanced models in many of my textbooks. And those textbooks were centered mainly around Italy or Europe. And about the same time, around 2008, I got into a big argument with one of the more prominent local economists. And I said that all of your equations on how to predict a increase in the productivity or the GDP or the GNP of Italy are flawed because they rely on this particular model, this way of modeling the economy. And he said, well, what's wrong with it? And I said, well, first of all, you don't have leakages. For example, at the time, Italians were burying in the ground at least a third of their agricultural produce. Lemons and oranges and bell peppers, you name it. 33% was being buried in the ground before even reaching the market. And I'm not talking about the spoilage on the dock. I'm not talking about how many good scraps of food that Italian families throw away every year. I was talking just about the leakage from between the farm and the final consumer. 33%. Also, you don't have the drug trade model. As George Webb has pointed out many times, the drug trade is a huge part of the economic flows in any Western country. And I said, if you don't have the drug trade modeled at all, then all of the equations that you're using based upon those flows are flawed to begin with. They're relying on flawed assumptions. And I forgot the third element that I wanted to point out. The black budget. There is your budget, and we know, thanks to Julian Assange. I think we had this conversation immediately after me latching on to WikiLeaks. We know, thanks to Julian Assange and the others at WikiLeaks, that there is something called the black budget, and that is the source of income for many people in Italy. For example, one of my friends who's not the sharpest tool in the shed, he was somehow earning twice my salary because he was working for, I would call it an Italian version of Blackwater. Okay, it was a small company, about 80 people, but it was tied into, this group of ex-Digos, ex-para military that were somehow getting money from the black budget. And I said, if you don't have the black budget modeled, then, which is a huge part of the flow, because out of the black budget, a good number of people get their salary or some form of income, and that allows them to buy prosciutto and pasta and repair the roof on their house, etc. So the lack of a big budget in this model is, you're dealing with an extremely simplified model of the Italian economy. And maybe that's why all your predictions of how growth is going to be 2.5% or 6% are always completely wrong. And he took great offense to this, and he never spoke to me again. But the point is that we have to, here in America right now, We have to ask our county officials, our state officials, and officials at the elected officials at the national level to show their economic models that and make them prove that they have some kind of validity. Okay, they can no longer pretend, with bills on the Senate floor this thick, they cannot pretend that there are no leakages, that there's no black budget. We have to make them do their homework. We have to make them sharpen their pencil and go back. This is why I say that most of the economists, whether they be from the Chicago school or the London school or the MIT school or the Austrian school, mind you, all you Austrians listening, or the Austrian school, are completely flawed. And maybe that's why our fiscal policy is always in shambles and our monetary policy is always in shambles, and nothing good ever comes out of the policies that are put into place. So this is the second lesson that people in Georgia and people in Ohio and Illinois need to grasp onto. Force your local economists, especially those in a group such as ICLEI. I just spoke this morning with Susan in Ohio, and she said that they're very concerned about this NOACA, Northern Ohio Association for, I forget what it is, sustainability or something. I forget what the CA stands for. But NOACA is a big issue, but no one is actually talking about the politicians and the bureaucrats in NOACA are throwing out numbers. No one is forcing them to sharpen their pencil and prove that their models are valid. Okay? Show me the money now becomes show me the data. Okay? Time is getting short. Tempers are starting to flare up. Show me the data. Prove to me. Fammelo vedere. Prove to me that these numbers, that these economic models, that these carbon models have some validity. Okay, why do I bring up again carbon, CO2? Because like Luciano Fontana's brother-in-law, he was very confused about why, if carbon was such a problem, then why was there no budget for the planting of extra trees or for nurseries or for better pruning of the trees? Why was there no budget for that? We have to go, if sustainability and specifically carbon dioxide is going to become their fallback for a lot of these arguments on the economic sector, then we have to make them show that carbon dioxide is really a problem, make them prove that, like in the NOACA document, we're going to see 5 degrees increase in the average temperature in Northeast Ohio by 2050. I think that is a real stretch because, first of all, at MIT, the official stance is the average temperature of the Earth will rise 6 degrees by 2080. So 5 degrees by 2050, where's that number coming from? That's what I want to know. I wasn't born in Missouri, but I still want to know, where's the data? Let me see the data. Let me examine the data. Let me take it to my friends who are professional economists and not bought and paid for. And let me take that data to my friends who are scientists, not bought and paid for. Let's see who's right. Julian Assange asked a very good question back in 2011. Why don't we have a debate? over CO2. We have in Italy, we have something called the, I guess you translate it as the oil drum. It's a committee, an association of scientists and economists who are discussing at the time the peak oil phenomena. And there was concern that the earth was running out of petroleum, that there were only a few billion barrels of oil under the earth's crust, and we had to use them wisely. But the debate grew and the debate grew and it grew to the point where finally those who said we're at a very short, we'll reach peak oil by 2045 had to back down, and they had to say, già, avete ragione, you guys were right. The peak oil won't be in 2045, maybe in 2090. And then they were forced to say a few years later, well, maybe in 2130, we'll hit peak oil. So it's very important to force these people, especially if they come from a World Economic Forum young global leaders formation, or whether they, if they come from a United Nations formation, force them to show their hand, force them to show their work. Like when you were in high school, the professor would always say, show me your work. Well, let's extend that same invitation to our quote self-appointed leaders. Show me your work. Let's go back to the other graphic. All right, here we have a typical magazine. Here we have a typical magazine from the local economic press. This one is in Udine. As you remember from George's trip to Europe in April, Udine is in the northeast of Italy, not too far from the Slovenian border. And Udine has I like Udine. I've made 2 trips there for business purposes, and it's a very livable town. And back in the early 90s, when I made my first visit, things were booming. There was a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, also because the Soviet bloc had broken down in 1989, and there was a lot of pent-up entrepreneurship, and some of that spilled over into northeast Italy. So Udine was a very hopping town, especially if you were under 40 and you had some cash to invest or to spend on some economic activity. Udine was a good place to be. But by let's say 2010, it had severely tapered off. And a lot of people in Udine were worried about the future for their sons, especially the farmers. The farmers were very worried that they would not be able to continue without some kind of subsidy or ulterior subsidy from the European Union or from down in Rome. And what I got out of reading, I used to subscribe to several different magazines like this, but for the Piedmont region. And going back through some of the old copies, I realized how much razzle dazzle, what would you call it? Wendy Sloan would call it the white coat hypnosis. The ability of the professionals, quote unquote professionals, with the lab coat to hypnotize the public. And they use a lot of terms, like Drew the Very Baker pointed out. They use a lot of terms that the average citizen, your average businessman, really doesn't understand, like la curva di Phillips, the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is let's pull that up. The Phillips curve might have had sense. It might have had some validity as a basic model back in 1930. Let's pull that up. So the Phillips curve states that there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Let's blow that up a little bit. An inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now, as we all know, that is not even close to being true today. In Italy, we have an inflation rate of about 15%. It could very, very soon be 20%, which is historically over the past 50 years an all-time high. And unemployment is 40%. Okay, I misspoke. In the under 35 bracket, between the ages of 20 and 35, unemployment is closing in on 40%. So the Phillips curve, it really doesn't mean anything. It has, yes, you could argue that if a superhero like Elon Musk were to come down and land in Italy and create a $5 billion business and hire 20,000 people, then you would see a slight drop in inflation. Okay, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So all of the theories, what I'm trying to get at here is because of high-speed trading, because of the black budget, for a whole series of reasons, all of my economics textbooks are completely worthless now. One example is from the legendary F.A. Hayek, okay? One of the premier proponents of the Austrian school. F.A. Hayek would say that as the price of vegetables goes up, people will will be more conservative in their use of the vegetable. They will throw away much less. Instead of cutting off a third of the asparagus, they'll maybe cut off only 10%, the last 10% of the asparagus. But the exact opposite is now true. Even though the price of vegetables, depending on which region or province you're in, has gone up by 2 to 3.5 times, the level of waste has also gone up. It does not make sense. But in this upside down world, nothing is making sense. And yet the economists, and I'm thinking of one in particular at the University of Turin, the economists are still making $400,000 a year to pump out the same shtick that they've been doing for the past 30 years. We can get to, I was in the room the day one of these economists got up in front of a panel of European experts, and he said, if we can raise gamma from 1.4 to 1.9, then we'll see the GDP. He put this real long series of equations on the board. If we can raise it to 1.9, this coefficient in this one term, then we'll see GDP rise from 2.5 to 4%. And everybody in the room applaud. Oh, meraviglioso, bravissimo, bravissimo. But it was a worthless presentation, because all of the models, all of the basic assumptions that his presentation was based on were no longer true in the year that he was presenting it. I think it was somewhere between 2002 and 2005. So again, another lesson is, well, let's look at another curve that is no longer true. What's it called? The J curve. Let's pull that up. So the J curve tells us that the trade deficit will get worse and worse after the currency depreciates. That was true in 1930, generally true, okay? It was a good going in initial baseline model. But that is no longer true. If you get the economic data, especially for Italy, France, Spain, I'm not sure about England, but if you look at the actual data over the past 10 years, the J curve is no longer valid. Now you remember with Brexit, okay, what was Brexit? Brexit said the proponents of Britain getting out of the European Union was that in short, if we can get out of the European Union and be more autonomous in our behavior, then our GDP will be much, much greater. Some said by a factor of 2. I think that's a slight exaggeration, but let's say that there were some numbers. At least some of the economists in Britain at the time believed that. And this goes back to also in Texas. Texas, in 1992, there was a movement to secede from the United States in Texas. And many of the libertarian economists in Texas at the time predicted a 3-fold rise in GDP if they could secede from the Union. But anyway, Brexit's main, I saw a lot of figures like this one, analyses using the Phillips curve and the J curve and the standard tools to show how Brexit would be a really good thing for the people there in England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, again, the Brexit was very hotly debated. It was on, if you lived in the UK at the time, it was on every night at 6 o'clock news. And it was a very big deal. And so you had students literally throwing punches at each other over who was right. Would we be better off with getting out of the European Union or staying with the European Union? Remember, stronger together. And, we have to compete with China, Russia, the United States, South America. We're stronger together. So this debate kept going back and forth. But the guys running the numbers on both sides were using tools from the 1930s, or at best from the early 1960s. And we have to not, here in the United States, we have to not repeat those mistakes. We have to make sure that our economists predicting, for example, California wants to get out of the Union or become a highly autonomous zone within the United States. If you live in California, you want to make sure, especially if you have a lot of property, you want to make sure that the economists in California have a model with valid assumptions. Is the black budget included, and its various the other elements associated with it, not only in California but around the world? Are they using modern tools for the analysis of imports and exports? Are they including contraband? Are they, make sure that the arguments, in theory, we're a somewhat democratic republic. If this is a government of, by, and for the people, then we have to be sure that there's a degree of realism in the models on which the people will decide their future. Okay? The same goes back to carbon dioxide. My chief argument with the carbon dioxide scaremongers is that I went to a conference at MIT once, and 5 presenters in a row got up, and all 5 showed that the CO2 somewhere between 2060 and 2080 would achieve a 5 or 6% increase. But if you took the second time derivative of the first 5 years, they were completely different. Completely different. I said, how is it possible? If any one of you is correct, I mean, there must be some really huge disparity in your boundary conditions, in your going in assumptions. There's something massively wrong that none of you can predict even the first 6 months correctly. Your first 6 months are all over the map. So how is it that you can predict 50 years out? I just didn't get it. Anyway, going back to Northeast Ohio and this NOACA. If you live in Ohio, find a group of residents who think more or less like you and go get a professional economist and ask him to get their arms around the mathematical arguments being presented by the people at NOACA, who mostly come from the WEF, according to me, if you ask me. Ask the economist to check their models, NOACA's models, and show that there is a somewhat reasonable cost-benefit analysis being conducted. For example, does a new bridge in Youngstown, Ohio, does that new bridge truly reduce the carbon footprint? Is it going to last at least 60 years? Not like a bridge in Genoa. There's a bridge in Genoa that lasted, I think, 20 years before it crumbled and killed 20 people. Let them make sure that there is some independent oversight on the economic and socioeconomic analyses being conducted by these quote unquote community organizations or community improvement, which always have some UN backing or WEF backing. Do your homework. Study, break out your own high school economics textbooks and start to familiarize yourself with the terms being used. Don't let them razzle-dazzle you with fancy new terms that were just invented in the past 5 years, like resiliency. That's one of the terms that I hate. Resilient. We're going to make the system more resilient. And if you ask, well, what is resiliency? Ask 10 professors in Boston, you'll get 10 different answers. And this is one of my problems with this fancy new language. Well, if we use fancy new terms, then no one will have the courage to ask so we can do what we want. Anyway, yes, Wendy. End the Fed. Hear, hear. The Catherine Austin Fitts did a great presentation about 6 months ago on her site, solari.com, on the things that we need to do in every county, 15 things that we need to do in order to rein in the Fed. Okay. She didn't think it was really possible to just cold turkey end the Fed, but to rein it in and to minimize the Fed's impact on the vicious, divergent, cyclic behavior of our own economy. These 15 things had to be done. As soon as I find it, I'll send you all an email, or you can go to solari.com and look for it yourself. But we have to do these things. We have to make these people who claim to be our betters do the homework, do the hard work to show us that their models are correct, and that by tweaking these models, by making the monetary policy adjustments and fiscal policy adjustments, we're going to get the magical, bright, shiny new world that they've been promising us since 1969. Okay, I just have one real quick housekeeping issue. We have the Eugene Yu trial coming up in California in Los Angeles Superior Court. There's tentatively February 9th is the court date, and we want to prepare as much as possible for that trial. Eugene Yu, as you know, has been identified by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a Chinese spy, and we want to make sure that the radio stations, also a few alternative TV sites, but mainly the radio stations that have been pushing China, China, China for the past couple of years, are tuned into this case of Eugene Yu and his partner Lionel Nee. I'm even more concerned about Lionel Nee. The history of Italy since 1960 teaches us to be very suspicious of national figures, of elected leaders at the national level who have very strong business ties, who are themselves billionaires like Silvio Berlusconi, or of elected officials that have very strong ties or rely heavily on the members of the ruling class. And once again, I have to underline the idea that the ruling class in Europe has never gone away. So when you go to your local town council, your town hall, and you're talking with people about why things are going so badly here in America, ask them if some of the people in Europe, the ruling class in Europe, which has never gone away, they just took on different names. They hide behind corporations and behind the IMF and the European Central Bank. Are we sure that the ruling class in Europe doesn't have any sway in Washington, or in Gainesville, Florida, or in Youngstown, Ohio? Are we sure that we here in America, we make our own decisions and everything that happens to us is because we decided? The Europeans have no influence whatsoever. Are you sure? Okay, I think that's enough of my blabbering for one night. Thanks again, everybody, for your support. I really appreciate. I'm sorry I haven't got to all your emails. I will make a special effort tomorrow and Saturday to get to all your emails. And I would recommend that you keep on smiling, keep working hard, keep up the research. Don't give up the ship just yet. And I'll play out with hoping that we don't get another copyright strike. I'll play it out with a few more minutes of the Corosat, La Montanara.